So, why did we go to Vietnam?
We went to Vietnam because the word was that South Vietnam was being taken over by North Vietnamese communists, and at the time, Americans were anti-communist, and we thought that that was a worthwhile cause, even though it was a really small country. Had a small footprint overall as far as the communist takeover.
Okay. Do you think that during the war that we needed to stay in there as long as we did, or how? Like whenever Nixon gave his speech in '68 about staying in the war, despite the fact that the war was unpopular, do you think that we should have stayed?
I don't necessarily think that popularity had anything to do with it. I think that politically it was not good to stay there, and Nixon did make a commitment to get us out.
Yeah.
But I think the problem was that we were not fully committed. It's been called a war, but I don't believe it was ever declared to be a war. It was initially declared to be a policing action. And so we were very limited as to what we could do, where we could bomb, what things we could do to actually win a war. So when everyone says we lost the war in Vietnam, it was never fully declared or fully implemented.
Okay. The war it's a horrible experience. You served because you felt the need to?
Well, let's put it this way. Most people back then were enlisted, and they were drafted,
right?
Okay, because the draft was in place. I was one of the few people that were regular Army that were not drafted. So I didn't go there because I thought that South Vietnam needed to be protected necessarily. I went into the military I was restless, looking for an escape maybe, and so I enlisted for other reasons rather than reasons that said, okay, we need to really protect the South Vietnamese.
Okay. And then I guess coming home, how was life after the war?
Before I went over, when I was in the military, I was actually up at Fort Hood, and I came down to the University of Texas and attended a few rallies, and there were a lot of rallies against the war. Okay. And what I heard from the people that were in those rallies, those speakers, they were really misinformed as to what was going on. When I got over there, I think that I realized that people didn't really know what was going on. They thought that Americans were cruel, that they were killing innocent civilians, babies, children. The idea that their military was over there and they're a bunch of hostile belligerents toward all Vietnamese, I think, was inaccurate. When I came home, I did realize that the press and the people that were here were pretty much against our own military, which is very different from today. Today you've got people that actually greet the soldiers when they come home from Vietnam, I mean not Vietnam, but from Afghanistan and from Iraq.
Yeah.
And they meet them at the airports and they greet them, they welcome them back. I think that's great.
Yeah.
The way it was back then, people that were in the military that served over there, they came back and they were kind of shunned because there was a stigma attached to what Americans did over there. Americans were not perfect, and they came back, and a lot of them had problems. They had problems with drugs. They had problems with what happened to them over there. And so I think they were kind of shunned compared to today's soldiers.
Yeah. Okay. So the war, in your view, was it a necessary war?
It was not necessary.
Okay.
It was not. It was a testing ground. Before I went over there, I was up at Fort Hood on something they called West Fort Hood, and we tested all sorts of things like signal equipment, crypto gear, and sensors that were dropped in the jungle, all those types of things. I think it was, unfortunately, we lost like, what, 60,000 over there or something like that.
Yeah.
It was not necessary. It was used to keep our military on their toes, to be able to test out different weapon systems, things like that. It was a shame we came back and didn't really accomplish anything. Definitely not necessary.
And compared to, like, World War II, or I guess World War II, it was like, people thought, oh, this is the war to fight. It's the good moral war.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Vietnam, there was all the suffering and the tragic experiences, and it could have been avoided. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, war is, well, I don't know, because I've never fought, but would you say that war is hell?
I'd say a lot of it is, not all of it. World War II was a much greater tragedy than Vietnam.
Yeah.
A lot more people were killed.
And the Holocaust?
The Holocaust was bad, yeah. And but World War II is a different scale. I think that World War II was necessary.
Yeah.
And I think most people were backing the soldiers and our government whenever we went to participate in World War II. I think Vietnam was different because it was more of a small political statement that I think got out of hand, and a lot more Americans got killed over there than I think the original politicians thought was going to happen.
Yeah, because the Vietnamese used guerrilla warfare, right?
They did.
And
they did.
They obviously had a fairly good knowledge of the territory, like the Americans did in the Revolution. They used guerrilla warfare on the British.
They did, but then Americans did the same thing once they figured out what was going on. I mean, you can't drive tanks through the jungle, okay? So the Americans ended up using guerrilla warfare also. They just had the advantage. They would come in and they would drop their men into the jungle using helicopters, okay? They would use sensors in the jungle to figure out where the enemy was. They used the big bombers, okay, that drop bombs all up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, things like that. So they were high tech, they were high power. The Vietnamese suffered a lot more than the Americans did, just because of the firepower. Okay. But they were very good soldiers for the most part, and they did use guerrilla warfare. They had their tunnels, and they had different ways of harassing Americans and the South Vietnamese.
And do you think, on other circumstances, had the war never been fought, that maybe you and the North Vietnamese might have been friends?
Probably so. I mean, I was friends with South Vietnamese. I actually lived on a South Vietnamese base. I lived with a team of Americans with the Vietnamese, okay? And I worked almost exclusively with the Vietnamese when I was there. And they were good people. There were some good in the North also. I think on both North and South it was a political war. My interpreter that hung out with me most of the time was North Vietnamese. And so there's good people on both sides. And unfortunately it was the peasants, the little villagers, that all they wanted to do was farm their rice crops. They got caught in the middle and they suffered a lot for it.
Yeah. Like in Platoon, where it shows the...
In the movies,
yeah.
Yeah, the villagers suffered a lot, and I think the things that some of the Americans did that you may have heard about, that was due partly to frustration on the Americans' part because they had seen some of their American soldiers and friends get killed.
Yeah.
Because they were drafted, they didn't want to be there to start with. Also, a lot of the soldiers that we had were immature because they were very young. I think the average age of the soldier over there was about probably 19, probably less than 20. They were very young and immature, and they didn't really understand family values. They didn't understand the culture they were involved with. There was a lot of drug uses going on with American soldiers at the time. Okay, so there were a lot of problems with our soldiers over there.
I guess on another note, President Obama, he recently, when he was running back in 2012, he gave a speech on how we should welcome our soldiers back, and he gave the Vietnamese veterans in particular, he said welcome home to them. Because we had discussed earlier that the public didn't really take too warmly to the soldiers coming home. So when he said welcome home, do you think that had any meaning
to the Vietnamese, to the Vietnam vets?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No, it was too late for that. It was way too late for that, and I think that was a political statement. 2012, did he say that earlier? 2008? Probably not.
Probably
Has
not.
anybody said it? I think it was a political statement.
No.
And I think most Vietnam vets would just ignore it and blow it off.
Okay. I think that pretty much covers all the questions I had for you.
Okay.
Okay.
Good
Thank
to
you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.